You know, there's something rather peculiar that happens when you're around certain people. You can't quite put your finger on it, but something about them feels different, not in an obvious way. They're not glowing or floating or speaking in mystical riddles. No, it's subtler than that. More unsettling, actually. They make you feel uncomfortable in a way you can't explain. And here's what's curious. The discomfort isn't because they're doing anything wrong. It's because they're operating at a frequency most people can't match. What spiritual teachers call high vibration, Carl Jung would call high consciousness. And it shows up in the most unexpected ways, not in what you'd think, not in meditation or crystals or talking about energy. In fact, if you're looking for the typical signs of spiritual development, you'll miss these people entirely. Because the real signs, the ones that actually indicate someone is operating at a higher level of consciousness, they're unusual, counterintuitive. Sometimes they look like the opposite of what you'd expect from someone who's spiritually evolved. And most people completely miss them. They're looking for the performance of spirituality when the real thing looks nothing like the performance. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying what makes someone psychologically evolved, what he called individuated. And what he discovered was remarkable. The people who'd done the deepest work, who'd integrated their shadow and become whole, they didn't look like what people expected. They didn't fit the stereotype. They showed signs that were often the opposite of what society considers spiritual. And if you're noticing these signs in yourself, or if people are reacting strangely to you, you need to keep watching, because what I'm about to tell you will explain everything. There are 3 unusual signs that only people with high vibration show. 3 behaviors that mark someone as genuinely evolved rather than performing evolution. 3 things that most people completely misinterpret. And if you understand these signs, you'll stop looking for spirituality in all the wrong places. You'll stop judging yourself for not fitting the spiritual stereotype, and you'll recognize genuine consciousness when you encounter it. The first sign is the most counterintuitive. People with high vibration are completely comfortable with conflict. Not that they seek it out or create it unnecessarily. But when conflict arises, when disagreement happens, when tension emerges, they don't run from it. They don't smooth it over. They don't people please their way out of it. They meet it directly, calmly, without fear. And this confuses people. Because we've been taught that spiritual people are always peaceful, always harmonious, always avoiding confrontation. We think high vibration means being nice all the time, agreeable all the time, never making waves. But that's not high vibration. That's conflict avoidance dressed up as spirituality. That's people-pleasing masquerading as peace. Now, here's what most people completely miss about this. And understanding this will change how you see everything. Jung understood something crucial. Real peace isn't the absence of conflict. Real peace is the ability to be in conflict without losing your center, to disagree without becoming disagreeable, to stand in tension without collapsing into reactivity. This is what he called holding the tension of opposites. The capacity to remain whole, even when forces are pulling in different directions. People with high vibration have developed this capacity. They can say no without guilt. They can disagree without attacking. They can set boundaries without apologizing. They can express anger without being controlled by it. They've learned that conflict isn't the enemy. Avoiding necessary conflict is. That speaking truth that creates tension is often more loving than keeping peace through silence. And this makes people deeply uncomfortable, because most people are still operating from unconscious patterns where conflict equals danger, where disagreement equals rejection, where boundary setting equals meanness. So when they encounter someone who's comfortable with conflict, who won't smooth things over or pretend everything is fine. They think something is wrong with that person, that they're not spiritual, that they're aggressive or difficult or problematic. But here's what's actually happening. The high vibration person has integrated their shadow. They've made peace with their own aggression, their own anger, their own capacity for conflict. So they're no longer afraid of it. They don't need to avoid it to maintain an image of being spiritual. They can be authentically confrontational when confrontation is called for. And that authenticity is what high vibration actually looks like. Most people performing spirituality are terrified of conflict because they haven't integrated their shadow. They're still trying to be only light, only love, only peace. And that rejection of their own darkness makes them weak, makes them avoidant, makes them manipulatable. The high vibration person has no such weakness. They've owned their darkness, so they can move through conflict without being destroyed by it. The second sign is equally unusual. People with high vibration don't talk about their spirituality. They don't announce that they're awakened. They don't constantly reference their practices or their beliefs or their level of consciousness. They don't use spiritual language or identify themselves as spiritual seekers or tell you about their meditation practice unless directly asked. And this is bizarre to people who are used to spiritual communities where everyone is constantly discussing their journey, their awakening, their practices, their insights, where spirituality is performed through language, through identity, through constant reference to being on a path, where being spiritual means talking about being spiritual. But here's what's actually happening, and this is what separates genuine evolution from spiritual performance. Jung observed something fascinating. People who'd actually done the deep work didn't need to talk about it. Their presence spoke. They're being communicated what words couldn't capture. They'd become what they'd been seeking, rather than endlessly seeking what they wanted to become. And becoming doesn't require announcement. It simply is. People with high vibration have moved beyond spiritual identity. They're not spiritual people performing spirituality. They're simply people who've become conscious. And consciousness doesn't announce itself, doesn't need validation, doesn't require others to see it or acknowledge it or confirm it. It just is. Quietly. Naturally, without performance. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. And who you actually are doesn't need to be labeled or categorized or identified as spiritual. It's just you, fully, wholly, without the costume of spirituality covering your actual being. So, when you meet someone with high vibration, you might never know they meditate. You might never hear them talk about energy or consciousness or awakening. They might seem completely ordinary, and that's precisely the point. They've integrated their spirituality so completely that it's no longer separate from them, no longer something they do or talk about. It's what they are. And being doesn't need announcement. This confuses people who are still in the performance phase, who define themselves as spiritual, who build identity around practices and beliefs, who need others to see them as evolved. When they encounter someone who doesn't perform spirituality at all, they often don't recognize the high vibration. They think the person is unconscious, unawakened, ordinary, when actually that person has moved beyond the need for spiritual identity into simply being. Now, here's the third sign, and this one is perhaps the most misunderstood. People with high vibration are selectively present. They're not available to everyone. They don't say yes to every invitation. They don't maintain relationships that drain them. They're not accessible 24/7. They guard their time, their energy, their presence like it's precious, because it is. And this drives people crazy, because we've been taught that spiritual people are selfless, always giving, always available, always putting others first. We think high vibration means being of service all the time, helping everyone, never saying no, sacrificing your own needs for others. We confuse martyrdom with spirituality, boundarylessness with love. And if you're recognizing these signs in yourself and want to understand what they mean without second-guessing your growth, check out our guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get it and learn how to recognize genuine evolution versus spiritual performance. But Jung understood something crucial. You can't give from an empty cup. You can't be present for others if you're not present for yourself first. You can't hold space for anyone else's consciousness if you haven't first created space for your own. Selflessness without self-care isn't spiritual. It's self-abandonment, and self-abandonment creates resentment, burnout, and ultimately serves no one. People with high vibration have learned this. They've discovered that being selectively present, choosing carefully where they invest their energy, who they spend time with, what they say yes to, isn't selfish. It's wise. It's necessary. It's how you maintain the high vibration instead of letting it be drained by people and situations operating at lower frequencies. This doesn't mean they're cold or uncaring or self-absorbed. It means they've developed what Jung called discrimination, the ability to distinguish between what genuinely needs their energy and what's just drama, between who's actually seeking growth and who's seeking to drain them, between obligations that serve their purpose and obligations imposed by guilt or conditioning. And this selective presence looks like selfishness to people who expect unlimited access, to people who think spiritual people should always be available, always accommodating, always sacrificing. When a high vibration person sets boundaries, says no, prioritizes their own needs, these people feel rejected, abandoned. They think, you've become selfish, you've lost your compassion, you're not spiritual anymore. But here's what they're missing, and this is crucial. The high vibration person has learned that sustainable presence requires boundaries, that you can't maintain high consciousness if you're constantly letting it be pulled down by low consciousness interactions, that protecting your energy isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation, and self-preservation is necessary for anyone who wants to maintain their vibration instead of constantly being dragged back down to collective unconsciousness. Jung talked about this as the necessary egoism of consciousness, to become conscious, to individuate, to operate at a higher vibration. You have to prioritize your own psychological development. You have to protect your inner work. You have to be selfish with your energy in service of maintaining the consciousness you've worked so hard to develop. This isn't spiritual bypassing. This is spiritual sustainability. So, the high vibration person doesn't answer every call, doesn't accept every invitation, doesn't maintain every relationship. They're selective, intentional, protective of what they've cultivated. And to unconscious people, this looks like they've lost something, lost their kindness, their generosity, their spirituality, when actually they've gained something. The wisdom to know that being present for everyone means being truly present for no one, including themselves. So what does it actually mean when someone shows these three unusual signs? When they're comfortable with conflict, don't talk about their spirituality, and are selectively present, It means they've moved beyond spiritual performance into actual embodiment. They've stopped trying to be spiritual and have become conscious. They've integrated their shadow, individuated, found their center. And here's what's crucial to understand. These signs look unusual because most people's idea of spirituality is based on performance rather than being. We expect spiritual people to be always peaceful, always talking about their journey, always available. But that's not what genuine high vibration looks like. That's what spiritual ego looks like. That's what unconscious people think consciousness should look like. Now here's the part almost nobody realizes about these signs. The reason these behaviors seem unusual, the reason they don't fit the spiritual stereotype, is because they're real. They're not curated. They're not performed. They're not designed to look spiritual to others. They're simply how someone operates when they've done the deep work of integration and individuation, when they become whole rather than trying to appear enlightened. Jung made a crucial distinction between the persona, the mask we show the world, and the self, who we actually are. Most spiritual seekers are building a spiritual persona, trying to appear evolved, awakened, high vibration. And that persona requires performance, requires talking about spirituality, avoiding conflict to seem peaceful, being always available to seem selfless. But people who've actually individuated, who've actually integrated their shadow and become whole, they've moved beyond persona. They're operating from self. And self doesn't need to perform, doesn't need to appear spiritual, doesn't care what others think about their level of consciousness. Self just is, fully, authentically, without pretense. So, these unusual signs, the comfort with conflict, the absence of spiritual talk, the selective presence, these aren't strategies. These aren't techniques for appearing evolved. These are simply how genuine consciousness expresses itself. Naturally, without effort, without performance. This is what someone looks like when they've stopped trying to be spiritual and have simply become conscious. If someone is reading this and recognizing these signs in themselves, here's what they need to know. You're not doing it wrong. You're not less spiritual because you're comfortable with conflict. You're not unawakened because you don't talk about spirituality. You're not selfish because you're selectively present. You're just real, genuine, operating from consciousness rather than performing consciousness. And yes, people will misunderstand you. They'll think you're not spiritual because you don't fit their idea of what spiritual looks like. They'll call you confrontational when you set boundaries. They'll call you selfish when you protect your energy. They'll think you're not awakened because you don't talk about awakening. Let them think that. Their misunderstanding doesn't diminish your vibration. It just reveals their unconsciousness. Jung would say, you're individuating. You're becoming who you actually are rather than who society thinks you should be. You're integrating your shadow rather than pretending you're only light. You're developing yourself rather than building a persona. This is the real work. This is genuine evolution. And it doesn't look like what most people expect. The high vibration isn't about being perfect. It's about being whole. It's not about being always peaceful. It's about being able to hold conflict without losing center. It's not about talking about consciousness. It's about being conscious. It's not about being available to everyone. It's about being truly present where your presence serves growth, including your own. These three unusual signs mark you as genuinely evolved, not performing evolution, not trying to appear spiritual, but actually operating from a higher level of consciousness. You're comfortable with conflict because you've integrated your shadow. You don't talk about spirituality because you've become it. You're selectively present because you understand sustainable consciousness. And if people don't understand, If they think you've lost something or changed for the worse or become less spiritual, that's their unconsciousness speaking. That's their attachment to spiritual performance. That's their inability to recognize genuine consciousness because it doesn't fit their stereotype. Jung spent his life studying individuation, and what he found was this: the people who'd done the deepest work often looked the least spiritual by conventional standards. They didn't perform enlightenment. They didn't announce their awakening. They didn't fit the mold. They were just real, whole, authentic, operating from consciousness in ways that confused and sometimes threatened the unconscious people around them. If these three unusual signs describe you, you're not less evolved. You're more evolved than people who are still performing. The comfort with conflict is strength, not aggression. The absence of spiritual talk is embodiment, not unconsciousness. The selective presence is wisdom, not selfishness. This is what high vibration actually looks like, not the spiritual performance, not the constant self-identification as evolved, not the unlimited availability, but the quiet, steady, authentic operation of someone who's done the work, who's integrated their shadow, who's become whole, who's operating from self rather than persona. Welcome to genuine high vibration. Welcome to consciousness without performance. Welcome to being real instead of trying to look spiritual. The world won't always recognize it, but Jung would. And that's all that matters. You're not unusual, you're individuated, and that's the highest vibration there is.